We're wrapping up Edgefield Day, and I thought that it would be nice, since we've got some folks together, to spend a little time reflecting on what we heard this week, and also thinking about what we'd like to hear next time and what we're looking forward to in the future. Uh, I'm going to be trying to bring in all of the folks that are here with us, as well as our remote delegates, as part of this conversation. And I guess I'll kick it off with a simple question. What was in your mind? Was there an overarching theme, or what was the overarching theme of what we heard here?
It was probably a couple of themes, right? Like security was obviously one, not only because of physical security, but also securing packages and software and everything from back on cloud or on-prem to these devices. So I think that was definitely an overarching theme from almost every vendor in some way, shape, or form. And then the other one was obviously orchestration when you're dealing with thousands of endpoints, making sure that it can be orchestrated. So I think the companies that were doing it really well had centralized management of all these things that had programmatic access, not only from traditional APIs and things, but also other tooling like Ansible and other bits and pieces. So I think, orchestration and security definitely prevalent.
I would just add to that zero-touch provisioning as a theme, and maybe even expanding on that to say the reason behind it is probably just a recognition that if you're going to deal with the edge, you're going to deal with so many copies, so many footprints of whatever you have, whether it's network, compute, or whatever else, that doing things with people is going to fail you, whether that's technicians to support things or just the provisioning process itself. But it seems like we had a theme that being able to automate that, have a really good control plane for your entire network of devices is just essential. And I think we learned a lot about that. And I think it's also a topic to keep learning more about in the future, because there's probably more that can be done there, or more that is being done there that we could find out about from others.
I think it was kind of clear that there's not one vendor solving for all the use cases right now. There's a lot of different definitions of edge and different buyers and different personas, right? Am I talking edge with a networking team? Am I talking edge with application team, storage team, compute team, right? All of these legacy business units, are still around in a lot of cases. So how do I, compress all of those business units into something very compact at a remote site?
And I think building on that, one of the things that I really saw is this concept of just taking the solutions that I've already had that I've used in the data center don't necessarily translate very well to the edge. In a lot of cases there were very similar technologies, and I think especially like in the automation space, orchestration, like at least conceptually, those things absolutely have to follow and be and support the edge transformation use cases, but they're not one for one. What I did with Kubernetes on-prem doesn't necessarily look the same or feel the same once I push that out to the edge.
Yeah, and I think there was a big element in that every time you increase in scale in something, you have to use different mechanisms to solve problems. So whilst you might have maybe a number of offices where you've deployed out, you might have an extensive robo environment and have techniques that work well in a robo environment, and think that you can then apply that out to go to another 10,000 locations. And a couple of orders of magnitude, your tools, your approach, your whole mindset has to change to cope with that difference in scale. And that was a really significant element that sort of draws through all of these pieces.
And just building on that, I think, and we talked about it a little bit in one of the earlier panels, automation is key. You cannot do this, and get the repeatability. You cannot get the scale or the velocity that you need to be able to do this without having automation as part of your strategy. And I think for a lot of organizations, that's the piece that is really hard for some people to overcome. It's how do you transform your organization to be kind of that with that automation first mindset. But fortunately, a lot of the vendors that we've talked to this week, are putting out the tool sets and giving you the tool chains to be able to take advantage of it.
But that automation also has to be very different at edge scale, So I've previously built automation to build a server where you stick a CD in and you tell it which side it's building at, and then an hour later it says, give me the second CD. That automation is fine if you're building 20 branch offices, but that automation just way too much human involvement in it. So the population-based automation, I think, is the important thing in here. It's not that you can automate a single site, it's that you can take that same automation and apply it across dozens, hundreds of sites and only have to handle any exceptions. It becomes more like policy-based automation rather than procedural automation.
Maybe one other thing that I felt like emerged as an idea was, I believe it was in our last presentation, talking about treating the cloud as kind of a North Star. And I think that idea of trying to apply as much of the cloud paradigm in terms of how we think about things and operate as possible is an interesting aspiration. But obviously, there's a massive set of constraints that you don't deal with in the cloud that are unique to the edge. And I think that's just interesting to continue to dive in and explore deeper and see what sorts of solutions can make some of those constraints feel like they're not there as much as possible, knowing that there's still going to be some that are just inescapable. Scaling compute and things like that is just going to be different. But I think that's an interesting theme that came up in a couple of the presentations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there are certainly a lot of lessons. And Brian, this is one of the things I know that you've been writing about recently. And you must have been taking a lot of time to write recently. There's a lot of great information there. But one of the things I've noticed that you're covering is that exact question. Basically, what are the lessons, sort of the overarching themes and lessons that we can learn that we can apply universally at the edge? And it does seem to me that's the message, that it's not. Yeah, a lot of the technology is the same, and a lot of the approaches are the same, but it's about really you kind of have to have a philosophy of it in a way. Am I wrong?
No, in my opinion, I think you're right, and I think this doesn't just mean that we have to apply the same technology. Like if we just said that using Edge and in the way that we use cloud means put Kubernetes there and you did it, I think that would be very wrong. I think what's important is probably actually the human side of it. So what's the developer experience like? And can you create a sense of consistency between what you do in your job as an application developer when you're pushing things to the cloud and when you're pushing things to an edge environment? And maybe in the future, there's even the possibility for that to blur some, so that you don't even need to really know. You just kind of know what you need, what resources you need, and you can start to do that. Like I felt like Avasa was starting to do some interesting things there with compute that was just kind of available in a fleet, and it could advertise its capability, and developers could pick where things went based on what they wanted, what tags they wanted. So I think that's a really interesting thing, and I think that gets more similar to what we want to be doing in the cloud and what we want to be doing in the edge. But sometimes the tech will be the same, and a lot of times it will. I think maybe it's about the things that are close to the engineers being as much the same as possible. We talked a bunch about the cognitive load of learning new things and new approaches and new tools. And, talent is tough to find, and teaching people things they don't know is difficult. So consistency and tooling close to the people is awesome. I think there's opportunity to abstract what actually happens at the edge more, and take more opinionated approaches, as long as you can kind of let people feel like they're working in a consistent way. So that's kind of where I think the future of it will actually go. Less about looking exactly the same in the tech and more about looking the same in the developer experience side of it.
It's interesting that the idea that Edge has any technology connection to the cloud, to me completely, that just, to me, it makes no sense, because when I think about building an application in the cloud, I'm thinking about building an application from prepackaged consumable services, and we're nowhere near that at the edge. We're far more like building our on-premises applications, where we build everything from the ground up for our application. We might use open source tools or commercial tools, but the application logic has to handle a lot more than the application logic when you're working with cloud native services. And the classic one, I'm afraid, Brian, is the idea that you can run it on Kubernetes makes it cloud native. That's a whole other rant that I won't get into here. But it's nowhere near cloud native just because it runs in containers. You can,
100% agree with you.
Cool. But yeah, that's what I see, is that the model for deployment into the edge is much closer to the model for building and deploying applications into into on-premises than it is to public cloud.
Well, modern on premises, and I think that's what gets me.
Reasonably modern.
Is that it's in a way, is it cloud infrastructure or is it just modern infrastructure?
Yeah.
Because I'll tell you, I am not going to deploy any application on anything that's not containerized. I mean,
Yeah.
Well, what if it's a database?
yeah. Well,
Right. Yeah.
You can
Where am I going to put my data?
external storage.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks
storage
for
volume.
that.
Right.
But what is critical about the North Star of the cloud is that all of these sites usually connect over the internet, and having all of your management in a software as a service kind of deployment off the cloud, I think, is more where the North Star of the edge is the cloud comes from. Now, it doesn't have to be public cloud. You can run that stuff on premises, but I'd rather have my vendor running the public software as a service than have installed software on premises, provided I'm allowed to use a software as a service platform.
And I think, one of the things that, I've seen in some of the use case examples and some of the things that I've experienced, in my past as well. As you're kind of, looking at this approach, I think from a testing perspective and looking at like your various failure conditions, edge becomes a much tougher, thing to solve for. When you look at the data center, there's while you may look at, okay, what if I lost my storage? What if I lost my network? Right? What if I lost power? In realistically, most developers don't really consider that. They really expect that is a very reliable environment, and public cloud is even taking that further. But as we reverse this back out to the edge, we've taken all of those things, and none of that is true, right? You can't depend on any of that. And so the way that you're developing and deploying your infrastructure, the way you're developing and deploying your applications on top of that, you really need to make sure that you're adding significant amounts of testing as part of this, and working through what those kind of various failure conditions might be. And a lot of them, depending on the environment, could be very strange conditions to replicate, whether it's EMI or other strange things, just based on the environment that it's in.
Yeah, heat, vibration, feathers, whatever. Yeah. So yeah, and I think that's absolutely true, and I think that one of the things that we talked about as well is that it is fundamentally different, and it's not just different because of one thing. It's different because of everything, because of scale, because of remoteness, because of connectivity, access and security concerns and everything. And yet, we are trying to apply the same modern infrastructure ideals to it, and there's a lot to be taken from that. I mean, the idea of the classic pets versus cattle, right? You cannot deploy pets at the edge. It ain't gonna work. It has to be, and maybe it's not even cattle.
It's going to be poultry.
Yeah, poultry. There you go.
Pets versus poultry. You don't want to be slaughtering cattle.
Yeah.
This is not a friendly thing to do. Also, my family comes from cattle breeding, and so cattle are expensive. So yeah, chickens instead. The extent to which, though, it is interchangeable and disposable locations. Right? One of the comments from one of the presenters was all of the sites will have exactly the same IP addressing. The actual IP address of the front counter device at the right-hand end of the counter will always be the same, and then they'll number to the left, right? And that the IP addresses of the cameras will all match. They'll be configured the same. This is where you really are getting interchangeable. Sure, physically you can't interchange them, but they're all exactly the same. They all look the same from the outside. They smell the same from the outside. And this is where you can do that extensive testing that Carl was talking about to make sure that when you do push them out, as they hit those weird edge use cases, you know what's going to happen. Of course, it means if you've missed one of those edge cases and it goes wrong, everywhere it goes wrong.
Which I guess highlights too, the other thing we haven't really touched on is observability and management, which again loops back to kind of what I started with around that central console, around being able to pull all the metrics, alerts, anything, all the telemetry that you can get to make decisions or have automation sit in front of that to kind of filter out the noise to help you make decisions around what might be happening at an edge site at any point in time. Because otherwise you've got thousands of sites out there that are all screaming or maybe not. stuff at you, you need to be able to kind of cut through that and see what should be an actionable event, and put appropriate rules and things in place to kind of bubble up the alert at times that make sense, rather than just as soon as it comes through, because we know that connections will drop, or someone might accidentally knock the power out of the till or point of sale unit or whatever at some point. So not bubble them up immediately, but maybe have some smart insights into those events that are occurring on premise.
Yeah, and I'm sure Brian, runs into this, especially in the restaurant space. Depends on the time of day, right? Like you get to the end of the day and it's, hey, I'm doing my batch upload, for all of the, the sales, data, the restaurant information. And I think that's it. It's understanding the environment that you're in. How do I need to handle that? Do I need to queue all of that up? Here's my priority queue, the things that I'm going to get out, quickly. But here are the things that I can batch out, over time, when it makes sense.
So I'll put an iconoclast question here on that question of observability and management. I love the idea of basically being able to virtually put myself in front of those machines that are remote. But is it realistic, or is it a better approach to not try to fix things?
That's definitely the cloud first approach, right? It's don't fix it, replace it. And I think we had some conversations about that, early on as well. It's, hey, if I've just got a Nook, that it's too hard to try to troubleshoot those things remotely. It takes twice as much time to be able to do it as just to say, hey, here's a spare, just replace it, send it back. We'll bring it back through, our whatever our testing and refurbishment process is, get it, and we'll get it back out. I definitely think for most places, if you can, again, assuming your use case supports that, taking that model is going to be, optimal for a lot of people.
And then a lot of industry and verticals that I'm seeing is that the edge is mobile. The infrastructure is built into a van or an emergency services vehicle, and it's never in the same spot.
Or cruise ship, or
Could be a cruise
vessel.
ship, could be somewhere that's never the same spot. So connectivity is never the same. You can't rely on that connectivity. It needs to operate in that offline mode just in case. And then you wait until that vehicle or ship comes back into dock or port or whatever it is, and then you service it, right? That's kind of how a lot of other, mechanical industries operate, right? I mean, a cylinder can fail on the engine and it still works, and when you get back, you replace it. So, I think disposable is an important part of it, right? Let's just fix it when it's the right time to fix it, not necessarily immediately. We don't need to respond like an IT incident.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest. Is you may still want to fix the thing, and especially depending on the cost, but you may be able to fix it offline instead of online, and just dispose of it, swap it, get the thing that it's supporting back up and running, and then come back around. And if you want to re-image it and start over, great. Or if you want to understand the root cause, great. But do it out of band, not live in the real runtime environment.
There's
We need
also
to reduce that mean time to repair.
Yeah.
Get that number down, get that as low as we can. Oftentimes that's going to be rip it out, put a new box in. That's going to be faster than, oh, maybe I'll get this solved in 2 minutes here. I got 2 minutes, and that 2 minutes ends up being an hour. Ripping it out, you're up and running, fix it later.
Which raises a good point, I suppose, about light repairs. Equipment that's in a data center often has sub 6 hour kind of call to repair and parts that are readily available. And I certainly don't know what the answer to this is, but how do we deal with spares when it could be 3 or 4 or 5 days to get the thing there, let alone if we're doing zero touch provisioning that has to be manufactured?
Or more. That's the thing. Because
do you have spares on site, or like what's that model going to look like in a distributed edge world? Every company is going to have different budgets and desires and tolerance for downtime. It's going to be an interesting model to see how that sort of plays out.
I think we're seeing an explosion of devices and things, and eventually we'll see the market start to narrow back down, probably in less and less devices and things, because it'll become more standard. I need maybe these fewer platforms to do these industries. Maybe even there's industry specific ways of doing this. Oil and gas has come up in a lot of times this week. So maybe that's just what it turns into, a standards body kind of situation of, if you're going to do edge, this is probably the best 3 ways of doing that.
Well, that brings me another question that I want to put to this group, and it's kind of like, is there an edge, or are there lots of edges? In other words, what I'm hearing here is that there's different use cases, there's different models, there's different levels of accessibility and serviceability and so on. Because if you are, if you've got a store or a restaurant and you can overnight them a replacement and somebody will pick it up in the morning and plug it in, that's a very different model than I need to get somebody on a helicopter on a North Sea wind farm. That might be months before you get up there. And so you have to kind of engineer all that in there. It seems like there's a lot of different edges and a lot of different use cases. And if we think that there's only one solution for the edge, then I think we're missing the point.
Yeah, and I think that the companies that were here demonstrated that, right? There was different personas and perspectives on these different edges.
Yeah, everyone had a different. I actually wrote down for every talk what their definition of edge was, just so at the end of this I could see what the difference was. And sure, there was some overlap, and we're talking about often remote things, but every single vendor had a completely different view on what edge means to them.
Yeah, and I think that's it. Just like in IT, I'm sure 50-60% of use cases from an edge perspective, will fit inside of one envelope. But those other 40%, like that's probably 400 different possibilities that all have different sets of requirements. That you can't really, handle in just kind of this, standards-based architecture. And I think that's it. That's one of the nice things is, there are a lot of people that are trying to solve this edge problem, that they're not, trying to overextend. They're focusing on a problem and trying to solve that. And so I think in this space, I think there's still a lot of opportunity, for people to go out and find a problem and come up with a solution that really fits for a particular industry or a particular sector.
That's exactly right. I mean, you basically seem to come back about what are we trying to solve at that edge, that location, and design the solution appropriately. If we're talking about a thing that we just need to collect metrics off, and it could go for weeks, a month or so, because it's storing stuff locally before we get that data back, it's going to look vastly different from a solution that perhaps is delivering vital health and safety, life and death situations. You're going to design a completely different looking edge, more like, with failover, and Scale can obviously do that, and with their nodes. And I think that's what it comes back to, is designing the appropriate edge solution using the right technologies depending on the use case.
Yeah, I was going to say just right sizing your investment. So based on the value of the thing that you're trying to do, you're going to invest different amounts of money in different types of solutions that ultimately meets whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. If you got a thing out in the ocean and you may not be able to get there, but it's critical, you're sure going to engineer it a lot to make sure that there's a really good chance it doesn't fail. And, but if you're dealing with, a gaming situation where you can hop to another endpoint, and somebody can pick up again, maybe it doesn't matter that much, and you just go for a cheap thing. As long as you use a NUC, I think we've decided that's what's most important, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. It seems like everybody's using NUCs. So, yeah. So I want to turn the page here while we're, kind of coming to the wrap on this one. We got about 10 minutes left. I want to turn the page here and talk a little bit about kind of what do we expect to see next time. So if we do Edge Field Day in another 3 months or 6 months, that kind of time frame, what do you think is going to be different? Now, obviously, we'll have some different companies. Hopefully, we'll have the Intel NUC people here to tell us what they're doing. But, hopefully we'll have some other different companies as well. I'd personally love to see storage solutions at the edge. I'd like to see some network, more different ideas around networking and operations and, containerization and deployment of containers. What would you like to see in middle of 2023, both in terms of companies presenting and technologies presenting, but also, where will the industry be? Who wants to go first?
I reckon IoT would be interesting space. I mean, we've kind of talked about, I think someone used it as like the pipeline concept or whatever, the sort of the building blocks of that we could build services upon on the edge. I think it'd be really interesting to have some vendors that had, some really good examples around smart IoT type sensors, really small, tiny little things that, instead we're talking about hundreds or thousands of sites, but multiple sites with potentially hundreds or thousands of sensors in them, and how sites are dealing with that at the edge. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of manufacturing type industries that have sensors along all types of pipelines and, embedded in environmental situations for things. And I think that'd be a really interesting sort of space to explore, is that IoT world a little bit more. And even I'm sure the connectivity options are slightly different around, LoRa WAN, instead of us, bringing everything back through a traditional gateway and, going out over internet or cellular or whatever it might be. It'd be interesting.
I think hearing from somebody who does gaming would actually be really interesting. I don't actually play games, but they tend to have a lot of technology challenges. And with some of the things developing in that space as it relates to like VR and potentially AR applications in the future, I think the idea of how they're thinking about solving those problems, getting their applications in their games and connecting peers to other peers, really close in a geographical region and sometimes across the world, like the way that they're thinking about that and their gaming edge deployments would be pretty fascinating. So I'd love to hear more about that. I think it would push the limits of the discussion maybe to another level.
Yeah, one concept is still going to be around security. If we're pushing more applications, more processing, more storage, anything out to the edge or a sensor or IoT sensor, someone focusing just on security in that market, I think, is going to be pivotal. That may be an existing big security player that comes in and wants to talk about how they're solving for this on top of, Docker or Kubernetes or Rancher, whatever it is that we're running out there. How are we solving east-west traffic? How are we solving for isolation within that cluster? How are we reporting back and then checking the boxes for the auditors that we're collecting all of that security information? That's a really big topic, I think.
Yeah.
If I could add one more, I think multi-tenant edge is interesting, and we kind of touched on it a little bit this time. But I mean, our application is for our purposes, so it's not multi-tenant. It's our applications.
Yep.
And a number of the use cases we talked about were serving like an oil company or things like that, but it's, single tenant. I think multi-tenancy, and there'll probably be more that emerges there and probably more people doing that in 6 months. So that'd be interesting to see how that develops as well.
Yeah, and I'm interested to see more old-fashioned apps actually being accommodated in these platforms. So the idea that everything is going to be built in Docker containers is great if you're starting from scratch now, but there's an awful lot of sunk investment and business value being returned by applications that aren't in Docker containers. So I'd like to see some more ideas or more coverage of what do you do for just deploying these applications that we've had for years out into thousands of sites rather than sending them to the dozens that we have previously. And how does that integrate then with deploying the applications that are built in a newer fashion and hopefully built using automation pipelines? So I think there's a melding of those worlds. IT always had a very long tail of the old technology, and we haven't had a mass extinction event recently to cut that tail off, and we're not going to for a while. So that coexisting of old and new is a really interesting part of the whole strategy. And with it, the idea of that integration, right? That over time, the feature sets that are solving a specific problem, we're going to build out to solve a wider range of problems. So maybe seeing devices that draw some of what we saw from Zedata with their secure platform, but maybe joining more with what we saw from Mako networks with the really strong security separation at the network layer. Those kinds of places of more things working together to give a cohesive whole, I think will be where we see, again, returning to a smaller number of devices because these platforms won't support everything.
There's two areas I think, that I would kind of find interesting, first, and it's not necessarily a technology area, but it really is in kind of the, fulfillment and refurbishment space. So, most people don't have, the warehouses and the places to be able to do kind of the fulfillment and refurbishment of edge devices. So if we do kind of start to take that approach where it's, hey, just replace it and bring it back. I think that's kind of an interesting area to see maybe where there's some innovation coming in that that space. And I think the other one, which is, and it's a little bit it's a little bit further out from the edge, but it's still there, is kind of this concept of local or edge cloud, which I think is another kind of interesting thing that I'd like to hear more from some of the cloud providers and the service providers that are really starting to push more services out closer to the edge, and see, hey, where is there opportunity to be able to start to integrate and take advantage of that.
One of the things that occurs to me too, number one, I'd love to see more innovative hardware. I love hardware, and there's a lot of cool stuff that's being built out there. I'd also love to connect with some of the telco world, because of course they're really important in all of this. I'd love to be able to hear from Comcast and Verizon and British Telecom and so on about, like, how are you serving this market and what innovative things are you doing to enable this. And as you mentioned just now, I'd love to hear more about 5G and LoRaWAN and Matter and Thread and Zigbee and all these other things that are being used out there in the IoT space to connect in with Edge.
Yeah, well, even other devices, right? Like, just as an example, DJI have these enterprise drones that are completely autonomous. They're programmed to do the same task every day, week, month, whatever, to go out and do inspections of oil rigs or solar farms. They're obviously going to have some infrastructure required there, and what are the challenges with dealing with that and with sites that might not have anyone there for 6-8 months because it's frozen or whatever. I think that's it's going a bit further from the edge, but it still is a device that's connected in some way, shape, or form to that edge location.
Yeah, it really is interesting, isn't it? And I think that actually brings one final thing that I'll bring in here as well is I really enjoyed the use case based discussions from some of these companies where they weren't just saying, here's what our device does. They were saying, in this market, in this area, this is the need that they had, and this is the constraint that was placed upon them, and this is how we are able to meet that need with our particular solution. And it wasn't we do everything for everybody. It was our solution meets the need of oil and gas company retail operations, or whatever it is. And I think that that's a really nice way to present this stuff, and it's also really, really honest, because it shows just the thing that we've been talking about this whole time, which is that these devices are all very different. They have very different pros and cons and use cases, and there's a place for all the things we heard from this week and all the things we'll hear from next time.